Well, hello, good evening. It's now time to make a start. Welcome to the first lecture of the new season for the Institute of Physics, West Midlands Branch, Hereford and Worcester Centre, and welcome to you wherever you are. This is our first time on Zoom webinar, so I do apologise for any gremlins. I've been asked to remind you that closed captioning is available. There is an option down somewhere where you can turn that on, where it says live transcript with CC in it. So if you're having difficulty hearing or would find that useful, then you can turn that on. If you want to ask a question, either of us or of the speaker, then please note there's a chat and a question and answer channel down at the bottom of your screen. So please use question and answer for anything you'd like our speaker, Clara, to have a go at the end, and my colleague Andrew Scott will put those questions to her. Maybe not your question directly, because we'll combine similar questions in some cases. If you just want to ask something informally of the organisers, you can put it in the chat. So I'm going to be quiet in a moment. I'm going to invite Nikki Thomas, who's going to introduce our speaker this evening. So see you later.
Hello. Oh, sorry. Hello there, and I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome you all to the Institute of Physics, Hereford and Worcester Centre lecture series for 2021-2022. So we are so fortunate to have this fantastic speaker for our first talk, Dr. Clara Nellist, who is a particle physicist from Radboud University working at CERN for the ATLAS collaboration. So I've known Clara for sort of well over a year now, I would think, and I've been so impressed by the wide extent of her science engagement work. She's really helps to demystify particle physics and share such a fascinating talk with so many people. And as a teacher, I've been able to share some of her things in my classes as well and watch them myself and so on. And actually, just as a hint, you can find many of her previous interviews and talks online. So do take the chance to look and sort of benefit from one of those spin-offs from having to be virtual for so long. So Clara worked at CERN on pixel detector upgrades. She studied the Higgs Boson and was working at CERN when the discovery was announced. And she's currently working on applying machine learning algorithms, looking for hints of dark matter in data from experiments at the ATLAS detector. So no more from me. Please welcome Clara to this talk this evening called On Top of Physics, Studying Nature's Heaviest Building Blocks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nikki, for the lovely introduction. So I'm just going to share my slides from here. So hopefully you now see the correct screen, which is just the full screen essentially. So yeah, tonight I'm going to be talking about the top quark, my favorite quark, or favorite particle indeed, in particle physics. And why is it useful? Why is it important? But let's start where I am. Well, not right now. Now I'm in my home office, but I'm based at CERN right now, which is a particle physics laboratory on the border between France and Switzerland. So this is a beautiful aerial view of the site, one of the sites we have at CERN. And here we can see